back to the show. Domestic violence is a sad reality in just about every culture, including Australia. The issue has moved in and out of popular culture over the past couple of decades, with a powerful feminist lobby presenting the issue as caused by vague concepts like male privilege and toxic masculinity and supposed gender inequality, which is an odd thing to assert in one of the most gender-equal countries in the world. They claim it's a society-wide concern and that men as a whole need to change their alleged attitudes towards women in order to end domestic violence for good. However, in 2019, the Australian Institute of Criminology conducted a landmark study that examined 39 quantitative studies of domestic violence over the preceding decade or so. And it found that not only was there a hugely disproportionate concentration of domestic violence in impoverished areas and Indigenous communities, but that only 2% of men were responsible for a full 50% of domestic violence nationwide. In addition, it revealed that a lot of domestic violence is reciprocal, meaning that yes, there are female perpetrators, and yes, there are male victims. Alcohol abuse was, understandably, found to be another driving factor. So why then is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese still saying things like men and boys clearly need to have discussions about domestic violence, as if it's solely an issue of gender? Joining me to help answer that question and more is advocate for the 1 in 3 campaign, Andrew Humphreys. Andrew, it is lovely to have you here this evening. How are you?
Thank you very much. Very good. Thanks, Daisy.
I'm very pleased we can have this chat because there's a lot of misconceptions about domestic violence. Now, Andrew, tell us about the 1 in 3 campaign and the work that you've been doing with them.
Okay, look, 1 in 3 was founded in 2009 by a man called Greg Andreessen, who was alarmed that the screening tools that he saw being used in New South Wales Health actually excluded any possibility of men being victims of domestic violence. And I came to 1 in 3 about a year later after working as a social worker in a country town where I found I was having presented to me male victims, largely through a family support agency where these men had custody of children. And they'd all been abused by the woman in that relationship. And that was when I reached out to and found 1 in 3, which is an informal organisation of men and women who advocate for men, but we also present to parliamentary inquiries, royal commissions, as well as a very little bit of support for men.
Because there is only a very little bit of support for men in the area of domestic violence, tragically so, because as the name 1 in 3 denotes, 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence are male. And the thing is, when the national attention is turned on male on female violence, after the row of tragedies we've seen recently, with 25 women found to have died from acts of domestic violence so far in Australia this year, terribly tragic. Of course, there's going to be national attention on that. But do you find that this national attention, coupled with comments like, well, men need to take responsibility, men need to change their behaviour, need to change their attitudes, do you think this makes male victims less likely to speak up?
Look, they're unlikely to speak up anyway, regardless of what the current debate is. And of course, if they do speak up, they're liable to be disbelieved. And under a number of the guidelines that they're the victims, they're actually unlikely to get support. And then many of the agencies, their codes of conduct, their mission statements preclude men from accessing them. So, I've had cases where I'll be looking support for a man, and I will ring a whole raft of agencies, and if they're not abusive, they'll just tell me to go away. So men, of course, they're reluctant to come forward. But no, it's no worse today than it was yesterday.
And it is just so sad because, I've done a bit of work in this space over the years, and I've always really felt felt for men. And look, what I find that, say, a lot of the sort of feminist lobby, shall we call them, pop culture feminism tends to weaponize, is that the majority of perpetrators of domestic violence are male. You know, as we know, men have more testosterone, they're more aggressive. It makes sense when you present them to certain stimuli that they're, you know.
I just sort of jump in there.
Yeah, go ahead.
In actual fact, if you include abuse of children and abuse of the elderly, where women are very significant proportions of the perpetrators, the balance comes back a long way. The denial of services for men in the domestic violence field was mirrored in what occurred with sexual assault. Where for many years men couldn't access the feminist sexual assault services, and that's being denied now. And I had a role in actually getting that stopped. So this is nothing new, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's prolific, and yes, thank you for jumping in, because that is true. In the abuse of children, women are very much culpable, and we don't hear any of that in the media. And what I find that feminists will do when you bring up male victims of domestic violence, they will just go, oh yeah, but the majority of perpetrators are male. Now, in my mind, it's almost like feminists are saying, well, those male victims deserve it because they're also male. You know, I don't know, that's my interpretation. What do you think?
Look, there's some pretty hateful stuff out there. I remember being told in a social work lecture when I talked about boys having eating disorders, and I was told to shut up. I just didn't get it. We don't care if you all go away and die.
Oh gosh!
And nothing occurred with that. But look, 1 in 3 tries not to get into that us and them with the feminists. We're about service provision for men and recognition of the existence of male victims. And we had success with that going right back to 2012, which was the New South Wales Legislative Inquiry into DV. And for the first time, male victims were acknowledged. But then the process that came from there, it took about 2 years. Male victims were acknowledged. Funding in 2 years was services. But for men to actually access that through victim services, you've got to go through the local safety committee, which will be feminist controlled. And they're not very friendly places for men. I was on one of those committees and I started raising the issue of the men I was seeing, and straight away there was a complaint made to my employer. And if it hadn't been for women on the committee saying, Andrew said nothing wrong in this meeting, I'd have been formally disciplined.
Oh, my goodness.
So it's very pernicious control. Yeah.
Yes, so that leads me to wonder about backlash, for instance, because, you know, it is the domestic violence narrative is very, very one-sided. If you come out, I know as a commentator, if you come out and try to talk about male victims of domestic violence, you will be horribly screamed at, you know, by people, you know, trying to sort of maintain this narrative. You know, and in the wake of the terrible Bondi stabbing, where the majority of the victims were women, that sort of attitude has come up again. So do you and or the campaign receive any backlash for prioritising male victims of domestic violence?
Look, we certainly do, and that's one of the reasons why our senior researcher didn't want to appear in video coverage. He certainly had some threats. I've been personally abused, but I've got a reasonably thick skin. And of course, I've seen many female victims of domestic violence too, and assisted them over many years. And I've tended to find that many of the agencies aren't very effective at assisting women either. That they're much more focused on their political issues rather than practical things like amplemesh and security screens and fuse box locks and a whole raft of practical strategies that can be put in place. But talking about a thing like the Bondi massacre, once again, that was an issue which seems to have been caused by a fundamental mental illness.
Yes, exactly.
And feminist social theory just writes off mental illness, brain injury, post-traumatic stress as precipitants of domestic violence. And I recall many years ago when I was working in a hospital with a lot of veterans and their widows, and there was a widow who'd had a hideous lifetime of domestic abuse. And at the hands of her veteran husband. And he'd been in Tobruk and various other high-level combat situations. And she made a really telling comment, and it was just, the army took away my beautiful young man and they sent me back a monster. And it's resonated with me ever since. Yes, and we write off those sorts of precipitants. Yeah.
And yeah, that's made me quite emotional. So that is so terribly sad, but it is so true. There's no room anywhere in the kind of feminist narrative for, well, certainly not for forgiveness or for solutions other than, you know, there's no room for forgiveness or redemption or for not justification, but at least an explanation sometimes for why, you know, some men act the way they do. So yeah, that's a very telling comment indeed from that woman. Thank you for bringing it up. Andrew Humphreys, thank you so much for coming on the show. The One in Three campaign does amazing work, and all the very best with everything. Really, really take care.
Thank you for the time, Daisy. It's been a pleasure.